The ultrasound screen flickered to black, and in that moment, Rose Matthews knew her world had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The sterile room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of medical equipment that now seemed to mock her, with its steady rhythm, a heartbeat where there should have been two. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Sarah Chen whispered, her voice barely audible above the crushing weight of silence that filled the examination room. The ultrasound wand trembled slightly in her experienced hands, hands that had delivered both devastating news and miraculous joy countless times before. But something about this moment felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air had thickened with unspoken truths. Rose stared at the blank screen, her 28-year-old body feeling suddenly ancient and hollow. The paper crinkled beneath her as she shifted, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. Her husband Michael's hand found hers, his calloused fingers interlacing with her trembling ones. But even his touch, usually her anchor in any storm, couldn't ground her now. She was floating somewhere between disbelief and devastation, caught in that terrible space where hope dies slowly and painfully. When? The word escaped her lips like a prayer, though she wasn't sure what she was praying for anymore. Clarity? Time travel? A different reality where this morning had never happened? Dr. Chen's dark eyes met hers with the kind of compassion that comes only from years of practice in delivering the undeliverable. "Based on what I'm seeing, it would have been sometime in the last 48 hours. I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need to ask, have you experienced any trauma recently? Any falls, accidents, or physical impacts?" The question hung in the air like a sword, and Rose felt her chest constrict, as if invisible hands were squeezing the breath from her lungs. 48 hours. The timeline crashed over her like a tidal wave, bringing with it the memory of yesterday afternoon, of her sister Lily's perfectly manicured hands pushing against her shoulders, of the marble steps of their childhood home, rising up to meet her with unforgiving certainty. "Rose?" Michael's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he sat right beside her on the narrow examination table. His green eyes, usually bright with laughter and mischief, were clouded with concern and something else, something that looked dangerously close to understanding. He had been there. He had seen everything unfold with the slow-motion horror of a car accident you can't prevent. The memory surfaced unbidden, playing out in Rose's mind with crystalline clarity. She could still smell the vanilla candles their mother always burned, could still hear the sound of heels clicking against polished hardwood as Lily had stormed across the living room. The family gathering that was supposed to be a celebration, Rose's announcement that she and Michael were finally expecting after 3 years of trying, had turned into something else entirely when Lily discovered that their father's will had been read without her present. "You orchestrated this!" Lily had screamed, her voice shrill with rage and something darker, something that had made Rose's skin crawl with its intensity. "You planned this announcement to distract from the fact that you're getting the house. You've always been his favorite, and now you're manipulating everyone with your perfect little pregnancy." Rose remembered the confusion, the way her family's faces had shifted from joy to discomfort to something approaching horror as Lily's accusations grew more vicious. She remembered trying to explain, trying to reach out to her younger sister, with gentle words and open hands, the way she always had when Lily spiraled into one of her episodes. But Lily hadn't wanted gentle words. She had wanted blood. The push itself had lasted only seconds, but Rose could still feel the shock of her sister's hands against her shoulders, could still feel the terrible moment when her feet lost contact with the top step and gravity claimed her. The marble steps, the same ones they had slid down as children, the same ones their grandmother had polished every Sunday after church, had been merciless in their judgment. "Mrs. Matthews?" Dr. Chen's voice pulled her back to the present, to The sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams. I know this is traumatic, but if there was an incident, it's important that we document it properly. Not just for medical reasons, but... She paused, her expression carefully neutral. But for other reasons as well. Other reasons. Rose knew what she meant. Legal reasons. The kind of reasons that turned family dinners into court cases and sisters into strangers. The kind of reasons that made you question everything you thought you knew about the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. Michael squeezed her hand tighter, and she could feel the tension in his grip, could sense the careful control he was exercising over his own emotions. He was a carpenter by trade, a man who worked with his hands and believed in fixing things, in making them right. But some things couldn't be fixed with wood glue and determination. Some things, once broken, stayed broken forever. There was an incident, Rose said finally, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Yesterday afternoon, at my parents' house, I fell down the stairs. The clinical term felt inadequate, sanitized. It didn't capture the betrayal that had cut deeper than any physical injury, didn't convey the way her sister's face had looked in that moment before the push, not shocked or angry, but coldly determined, as if she had been planning this exact moment for years. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, her fingers already moving to make notes on the chart that would become evidence, that would transform this private tragedy into something public and legal and permanent. Were there witnesses to this fall? Rose closed her eyes, and immediately she could see them all again. Her parents, her Uncle Joe, her cousin Maria, Michael's mother who had driven down from Portland specifically for the announcement. They had all been there, had all seen Lily's hands make contact with Rose's shoulders, had all watched as she tumbled down those unforgiving marble steps with a sickening series of impacts that would replay in her nightmares for months to come. But seeing and acknowledging were two different things entirely. Rose had learned that lesson in the hours that followed, when her family had gathered in the hospital waiting room with faces full of worry and voices full of carefully chosen words that painted Lily's actions as an accident, a moment of emotional overwhelm rather than a calculated attack on the life growing inside Rose's womb. It was crowded, Rose said carefully, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. People saw different things. It wasn't a lie, exactly. People had seen different things. Her parents had seen their troubled younger daughter having an emotional breakdown. Uncle Joe had seen a family dispute that got out of hand. Maria had seen an accident that could happen to anyone. Only Michael had seen what Rose had seen. The deliberate nature of Lily's actions, the split second of calculation in her sister's hazel eyes before she made her choice. Only Michael had been close enough to witness the way Lily had positioned herself, had waited for the perfect moment when Rose was balanced at the top of the stairs, vulnerable and trusting. And only Michael had heard what Lily whispered in the chaos that followed, as Rose lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs with blood seeping through her pale yellow dress. The dress she had chosen specifically because it brought out her eyes, because she wanted to look perfect for the announcement that was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. I hope it was worth it, Lily had hissed, kneeling beside Rose's broken form with tears streaming down her face that looked more like tears of rage than remorse. I hope you're happy now that you've destroyed our family. The words had been spoken quietly enough that only Rose and Michael heard them, whispered confessions masked as concern in the confusion of paramedics and police reports and family members trying to make sense of what had just happened. To everyone else, Lily appeared to be the devoted sister, overcome with grief and guilt over the terrible accident that had befallen her pregnant sibling. But Rose had heard the truth in those words, had recognized the satisfaction buried beneath, the performance of sorrow. Lily hadn't been apologizing. She had been gloating. Dr. Chen finished her notes and set the chart aside, her movements careful and deliberate. Rose, I want you to know that we're going to take very good care of you. both physically and emotionally. There are counselors here who specialize in pregnancy loss, and there are also advocates who can help you understand your options moving forward. Options. Rose knew what that meant too. The option to press charges. The option to let the truth destroy what remained of her family. The option to choose justice over peace, honesty over harmony. Michael's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a gesture of comfort that had become automatic between them over their 6 years together. He was waiting for her to decide, she realized, waiting to see if she would choose the difficult path of truth or the easier path of silent suffering that her family was already trying to pave for her. Her phone buzzed against the examination table, and she glanced down to see a text message from her mother. Lily is devastated about the accident. She's not eating, not sleeping. Please call her, sweetheart. She needs to know you forgive her. Forgive her. As if forgiveness was something that could be dispensed like medication. As if absolution was Rose's responsibility rather than justice, being Lily's consequence. As if the life that had been growing inside her for 12 precious weeks was somehow less important than her sister's emotional comfort. Rose stared at the message until the words blurred together, until they became meaningless symbols on a screen that demanded she choose between being a good sister and being an honest woman. She thought about the nursery they had started planning, the tiny clothes Michael had been secretly buying, the names they had whispered to each other in the dark sanctuary of their bedroom. And then she thought about Lily's calculated push, about the satisfaction hidden in her sister's tears, about the way her family was already rewriting history to protect the guilty and silence the victim. Dr. Chen, Rose said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to know exactly what you found. I need documentation of everything, and I need to understand what that documentation might mean in terms of legal proceedings. Michael's hand tightened around hers, a silent show of support that gave her strength. Whatever came next, whatever consequences her pursuit of truth might bring, she wouldn't face them alone. But even as she made the decision to document the truth, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of another precipice, that seeking justice for one loss might cost her everything else she held dear. Her family's love, her sister's future, the carefully constructed peace that had held their dysfunctional clan together for nearly 3 decades. The ultrasound screen remained black, a void that reflected her own sense of loss and uncertainty. In that darkness, Rose saw the ghost of the future that had been stolen from her, the shadow of the child who would never draw breath, never hear lullabies, never know the fierce protection of a mother's love. And in that same darkness, she saw the outline of a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone she had once considered family. Rose stared at the ceiling of their bedroom at 3 a.m, her body aching in ways that went far beyond the physical trauma of her fall. The prescription bottle on her nightstand contained pills that were supposed to help with the pain, but there was no medication for the hollowness that had taken up residence in her chest, no remedy for the way every breath felt like an effort she wasn't sure she wanted to make. Beside her, Michael slept fitfully, his breathing irregular and punctuated by small sounds of distress that told her his dreams were no more peaceful than her waking hours. They had been married for 4 years, together for 6, and she had never seen him look as lost as he had in the days following the miscarriage. Her strong, capable husband, who could build furniture from nothing more than raw wood and determination, had been rendered helpless by the deliberate cruelty of her sister's actions. The house around them felt different now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of their grief and transformed their sanctuary into something foreign and uncomfortable. The spare bedroom that they had been quietly converting into a nursery stood like a monument to their shattered dreams, its door closed but its presence impossible to ignore. Michael had offered to put everything away, to pack up the few items they had already purchased and store them in the attic where they wouldn't have to see them every day. But Rose couldn't bring herself to let him. Not yet. it would feel too much like giving up, too much like admitting that their baby had never really existed at all. But the truth was more complicated than simple grief. Rose had been raised in a family where peace was valued above truth, where harmony mattered more than justice, where difficult emotions were smoothed over with forced smiles and carefully chosen words that transformed victims into villains and aggressors into the wounded parties who needed protection and understanding. Her phone lit up with another text message from her mother, the fourth one since midnight. "Rose, honey, I know you're hurting, but Lily is suffering too. She made a terrible mistake in a moment of emotional overwhelm. Surely you can find it in your heart to show some compassion for your sister. Family is all we have in this world. Rose." Deleted the message without responding, just as she had deleted the previous 3. Her mother's campaign to secure Lily's forgiveness had begun within hours of the miscarriage being confirmed. A relentless barrage of messages that painted Rose as heartless and vengeful for refusing to immediately absolve her sister of responsibility for the loss of her child. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a family that specialized in emotional manipulation, Rose had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for bad behavior. She was the daughter who remembered birthdays and organized holiday gatherings, who mediated disputes between her parents and provided a listening ear when Lily's latest drama created chaos in their carefully maintained family ecosystem. Growing up, Rose had learned to make herself small, to minimize her own needs in service of maintaining the delicate balance that kept their family functional. When Lily threw tantrums, Rose learned to be calm. When their parents fought, Rose learned to be the stable presence that could comfort her younger sister and absorb the overflow of adult emotions that had no other outlet. She had carried those patterns into her adult life, choosing a career in social work that allowed her to continue the role of caretaker and problem solver, marrying a man whose steady temperament complemented her need for peace and stability. Their life together had been built on quiet moments and shared dreams, on the kind of love that grew slowly and steadily like the oak trees in Michael's workshop that he transformed into beautiful, lasting pieces of furniture. But now, lying in the darkness of her bedroom with her womb empty and her heart shattered, Rose was being asked to perform the ultimate act of self-erasure. Her family wanted her to pretend that Lily's deliberate push had been an accident, to transform her sister's calculated cruelty into a moment of emotional weakness that deserved understanding rather than consequences. The weight of that expectation pressed down on her like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember who she was beneath the layers of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize everyone else's comfort over her own truth. Michael stirred, beside her, his hand reaching across the space between them to find hers even in sleep. His touch was warm and solid and real, anchoring her to the present moment and reminding her that she wasn't alone in this struggle. He had been there. He had seen what really happened. He knew the truth, even if everyone else was determined to rewrite it. Rose turned to study her husband's face in the dim light filtering through their bedroom curtains. At 31, Michael still had the boyish features that had first attracted her attention at the coffee shop where they met. But 6 years together had added laugh lines around his eyes, and a few gray threads in his dark hair that she found endearingly distinguished. He was a man who worked with his hands, who created beautiful things from raw materials, who believed in the fundamental importance of building foundations strong enough to withstand whatever storms life might bring. Their marriage had been built on that same philosophy of patient construction, of taking time to create something solid and lasting, rather than rushing toward passion that might burn bright, but wouldn't sustain them through the difficult seasons. They had waited 3 years to try for children, taking time to establish their careers, buy their house, create the kind of stable environment they wanted for their future family. When Rose finally became pregnant after months of trying, they had approached the news with the same careful joy they brought to everything else, cautious but deeply happy, already making plans and adjustments to accommodate the new life that would join their quiet, contented world. The pregnancy had felt like the natural next chapter in their story together. The fulfillment of dreams they had whispered about in the dark and planned for in daylight hours, filled with practical discussions about cribs and college funds, and the ways their love would expand to encompass this new person they were creating together. Losing that future felt like losing themselves, like discovering that the foundation they had built so carefully could be destroyed by a single act of deliberate malice from someone they had trusted completely. Rose had always known that Lily was capable of selfishness, of dramatic outbursts and manipulative behavior, but she had never imagined that her sister would be capable of something so calculated, so deliberately destructive. The push itself had been shocking in its casual cruelty, but what haunted Rose more was the look in Lily's eyes in the moment before it happened. There had been no heat in that gaze, no sudden surge of uncontrollable emotion. Instead, there had been a cold calculation, a split-second assessment of opportunity and consequences that had culminated in the decision to destroy Rose's pregnancy rather than allow her to enjoy something that Lily couldn't have. Because that was what this was really about, Rose understood now. Not the house, not their father's will, not even the family dynamics that had always favored the daughter who caused the least trouble. This was about Lily's inability to bear seeing Rose happy when her own life was falling apart. This was about jealousy so toxic that it had transformed into something monstrous, something capable of targeting an innocent life because it represented everything Lily felt she had been denied. Lily had never been able to maintain a stable relationship, had never held a job for more than a few months, had never demonstrated the kind of responsibility and commitment that made people trust her with important things. At 26, she still lived in their parents' basement, still expected financial support and emotional management from the family members she treated with contempt and manipulation. Rose had watched her sister's pattern for years, the way Lily would create chaos whenever anyone else in the family experienced success or happiness, the way she demanded attention and resources while giving nothing back except drama and disappointment. She had made excuses for Lily's behavior, had covered for her mistakes, had even loaned her money on multiple occasions that was never repaid and never even acknowledged. But this was different. This wasn't a borrowed dress that came back stained, or a family dinner ruined by one of Lily's dramatic exits. This was the deliberate destruction of an innocent life, the calculated theft of Rose's future, the kind of betrayal that couldn't be smoothed over with family loyalty and forced forgiveness. The first rays of dawn were beginning to creep through their bedroom windows when Rose finally gave up on the pretense of trying to sleep. She slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Michael, and padded barefoot to the kitchen where she started a pot of coffee with movements that felt automatic and disconnected from any conscious intention. Their kitchen had been one of Michael's first projects after they bought the house, a labor of love that included handcrafted cabinets and a breakfast nook where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations over the years. Every surface bore the mark of his careful craftsmanship, from the custom cutting board that fit perfectly over the sink to the spice rack that he had built to her exact specifications. It was a room designed for a family, with space for children, to do homework at the kitchen island and a pantry sized to accommodate the needs of growing bodies and busy schedules. Rose had imagined teaching her children to cook in this kitchen, had pictured flour-dusted counters and cookie decorating sessions, and the kind of warm, nurturing environment she had never quite experienced in her own childhood. Now the kitchen felt too large, too full of possibilities that would never be realized. The refrigerator held appointment cards for an obstetrician she would never see again, and the freezer contained frozen meals that well-meaning friends had brought over in the days following the miscarriage, casseroles and soups that she couldn't bring herself to eat, food that tasted like pity and obligation, and the awkward discomfort of people who didn't know what to say in the face of deliberate tragedy. Her phone buzzed against the counter where she had left it, and Rose saw her mother's name on the screen, accompanied by yet another message designed to make her feel guilty for refusing to immediately forgive and forget her sister's actions. "Rose, I'm very disappointed in your refusal to return Lily's calls. She's been crying for days, and your father and I think you're being unnecessarily cruel. This vindictive behavior isn't like you, sweetheart. Where is the compassionate daughter we raised? The message hit Rose like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands shake as she set down her coffee mug with more force than necessary. Vindictive. Cruel. As if seeking consequences for the deliberate destruction of. Her pregnancy made her the villain in this story, as if expecting her sister to face some form of accountability for murder. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? The killing of her child was somehow unreasonable and mean-spirited. Rose thought about the daughter her parents had raised, the girl who had learned to swallow her own pain to avoid causing discomfort to others, who had been taught that being good meant being quiet, that being loving meant being endlessly forgiving, even when forgiveness enabled and encouraged more harm. That daughter would have called Lily by now. That daughter would have found a way to make this easier for everyone else, would have absorbed the trauma and the injustice, and found some way to transform it into a learning experience that brought the family closer together, rather than forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about who they really were and what they were willing to tolerate in the name of family harmony. But that daughter had died on the marble steps of her childhood home, along with the grandchild her parents would never meet. What remained was a woman who had looked evil in the face and recognized it, who had felt the impact of deliberate cruelty and understood that some actions couldn't be undone or excused or forgiven away. Rose deleted her mother's message and blocked. Her number then did the same with her father's phone, with Lily's multiple numbers, with every family member who had been enlisted in the campaign to make her complicit in her own victimization. The silence that followed felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering that you could fly. For the first time in her 28 years, Rose was completely alone with her own thoughts and feelings, free from the constant pressure to consider everyone else's needs and emotions before her own. It was a freedom that came with a terrible price. The loss of the family she had spent her entire life trying to please and protect. But it was also a freedom that allowed her to breathe fully for the first time since the push, to feel her own rage and grief without immediately trying to transform them into something more palatable for other people's consumption. Michael appeared. In the kitchen doorway, his hair rumpled from sleep and his eyes still heavy with the weight of shared sorrow. He took one look at her face and crossed the room without a word, pulling her into his arms with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of loving someone deeply and completely. "I blocked them all," Rose whispered against his shoulder, the admission feeling like a confession of some terrible sin. "My whole family. I blocked all their numbers." Michael's arms tightened around her, and she felt rather than heard his approval in the way his body relaxed against hers. "Good," he said simply. "You don't owe them your pain, Rose. You don't owe them your silence." They stood together in their beautiful kitchen, surrounded by the life they had built with such care and intention, and Rose felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, that would take much longer if it ever came at all. But something like resolve, something like the first stirring of her own voice after years of speaking only what others wanted to hear. The sun continued to rise outside their windows, painting their home in shades of gold and possibility. And for the first time since the push, Rose began to imagine a future that didn't require her to pretend that her sister's cruelty had been an accident, that didn't demand she sacrifice her own truth on the altar of family peace. It would be a smaller future, perhaps, without the extended family that had shaped her entire identity. But it would be hers, built on the foundation of honesty rather than the quicksand of enabling lies. And maybe, Rose thought as she held tight to her husband's steady strength, maybe that was enough to start rebuilding from. The first crack in Rose's carefully constructed silence came exactly 1 week after she blocked her family's phone numbers. She was returning from her follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen, an appointment that had confirmed what she already knew, that her body was healing even as her heart remained shattered, when she found her mother sitting on the front porch of their small craftsman-style home. Margaret Matthews looked older than her 55 years, her usually perfectly styled auburn hair showing gray roots and her designer clothes wrinkled as if she had been wearing them for days. She stood when she saw Rose approaching, her movements, stiff with either arthritis or anxiety, and her expression held the kind of determined desperation that Rose recognized from years of watching her mother navigate Lily's various crises. "Rosie," Margaret said, using the childhood nickname that had once felt like an endearment, but now sounded like manipulation. "Please, sweetheart, we need to talk. This has gone on long enough." Rose felt Michael's presence behind her, solid and protective, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture of support that gave her the courage to face this confrontation she had been dreading. She had known it would come eventually. Her family didn't understand boundaries, had never respected the word no when it came from her lips. They were used to wearing down her resistance through persistence and guilt, through the kind of emotional siege warfare that had been their primary parenting tool throughout her childhood. "I have nothing to say to you," Rose replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm not ready to listen to anything you have to say to me." Margaret's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly, revealing the raw desperation underneath. "Your sister is falling apart, Rose. She's been hospitalized twice in the past week, first for dehydration because she can't keep anything down, and then because she tried to hurt herself. The doctors say she's having a complete breakdown, and it's all because you won't forgive her for what was clearly a terrible accident." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Rose felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. This was how it always worked in her family. The person who caused the harm became the victim who needed protection and care, while the actual victim was transformed into the villain who was causing additional suffering through their unreasonable expectations of accountability. "She didn't try to hurt herself because of guilt," Rose said quietly, the words coming from a place of clarity she hadn't known she possessed. "She tried to hurt herself because she's not getting the attention and sympathy she expected from destroying my pregnancy. She's not sorry she did it, Mom. She's sorry it didn't work the way she wanted it to." Margaret recoiled as if Rose had slapped her, her face cycling through expressions of shock, hurt, and finally, a familiar kind of disappointed anger that Rose had seen countless times before. It was the look her mother gave when reality refused to conform to her preferred narrative, when the messy truth intruded on her carefully maintained version of their family dynamics. "How can you say something so cruel about your own sister?" Margaret's voice rose to a pitch that would have sent Rose scurrying for cover just a few weeks ago. "Lily loves you, Rose. She's made mistakes, yes, but she's your blood, your family. And you're talking about her like she's some kind of monster." "She is a monster," Rose said simply, and the truth of it settled over her like a heavy coat, uncomfortable but necessary. "She deliberately pushed me down the stairs because she was jealous that I was having a baby, and she couldn't. She murdered my child, Mom. And instead of facing consequences for that, she's being coddled and protected while I'm being asked to pretend it never happened." The word murdered seemed to echo in the quiet suburban street, and Rose saw their neighbor Mrs. Patterson pause in her gardening to glance in their direction. The older woman had been nothing but kind in the weeks since the miscarriage, bringing over homemade soup and offering quiet condolences without prying for details. But Rose could see the concern in her weathered face as she took in the scene unfolding on the porch. Michael stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Rose and her mother in a gesture that was protective without being aggressive. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I think it would be best if you left now. Rose has made it clear that she's not ready for this conversation." Margaret's attention shifted to Michael, and Rose could practically see the calculations running through her mother's mind as she sized up the man who had dared to support his wife instead of automatically deferring to family hierarchy. In Margaret's world, sons-in-law were supposed to be allies in managing difficult daughters, not enablers of what she saw as unreasonable behavior. "This is between Rose and me," Margaret said, her tone taking on the Arctic quality that had been her weapon of choice throughout Rose's childhood. "This doesn't concern you, Michael. This is family business." "Rose is my family," Michael replied steadily, "and what happened to our baby is absolutely my business. I was there, Mrs. Matthews. I saw what your other daughter did. There was nothing accidental about it." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, and Rose watched her mother's face cycle through a series of expressions before settling on the kind of wounded righteousness that had been her default response to any challenge to her authority or her version of reality. "You're both being ridiculous," Margaret said, but there was something desperate in her voice now, something that suggested she might be starting to understand that her usual tactics weren't going to work this time. Families have fights. People say and do things they don't mean when emotions are running high. That doesn't make Lily a murderer, for God's sake. She's a young woman who made a terrible mistake, and she needs her sister's forgiveness to heal and move forward. What about what I need? The question erupted from Rose's chest with a force that surprised them all. What about my need to grieve my child without being told it doesn't matter? What about my need to feel safe in my own family without worrying that someone will hurt me again if I have something they want? What about my need to be believed when I tell the truth about what happened to me? Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Rose wasn't finished. Years of swallowed words and suppressed anger were pouring out of her now, unstoppable as a dam burst. "Do you know what she said to me while I was lying at the bottom of those stairs, bleeding and losing my baby?" Rose's voice was shaking now, but not with weakness, with rage so pure and righteous that it felt like a cleansing fire. She said, "I hope it was worth it. I hope you're happy now that you've destroyed our family." She wasn't sorry, Mom. She was gloating. "That's not—" Margaret began, but Rose cut her off. "And do you know what you said to me in the hospital while I was waiting to find out if my child was still alive? You said, 'These things happen for a reason, honey. Maybe this just wasn't meant to be.' As if my baby was disposable, as if losing them was just an inconvenience that I needed to get over so we could all pretend Lily didn't do what she did." The accusations hung in the air between them, and Rose could see the exact moment when her mother made the decision to shift tactics from guilt to outright emotional warfare. Margaret's expression hardened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of cold finality that Rose had learned to fear as a child. "If you continue down this path, Rose, you're going to destroy this family," Margaret said. "Your father's health isn't good. The stress of this situation has already landed him in the emergency room once. And Lily, God only knows what she might do if you keep refusing to show her the compassion she needs. Is your pride really worth losing everyone who has ever loved you?" The threat was delivered with the practiced skill of someone who had been using emotional manipulation as a weapon for decades. Rose felt the familiar tug of conditioning, the automatic response to prioritize everyone else's well-being over her own truth. But this time, the pull wasn't strong enough to override the clarity that had been growing inside her since the morning she blocked their numbers. "If this family can only survive by covering up the deliberate murder of my child," Rose said quietly, "then maybe it deserves to be destroyed." Margaret staggered backward as if Rose had physically struck her, her face going pale and her mouth opening and closing without sound. For a moment, Rose almost felt sorry for her. Almost succumbed to the lifetime of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize her mother's comfort over her own truth. But then she thought about her baby, about the tiny life that had been snuffed out by Lily's jealous rage, and the moment of weakness passed like a shadow across the sun. "Get off my property," Rose said, her voice carrying an authority she had never possessed before. "And don't come back until you're ready to acknowledge what really happened and support me instead of my abuser." Margaret's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks in a display of grief that might have been genuine or might have been one more manipulation tactic. "Please, Rosie," she whispered, "please don't do this to us. We're family." "No," Rose replied, and the word felt like a key turning in a lock, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. "Family doesn't cover up murder. Family doesn't ask victims to protect their abusers. Family doesn't sacrifice one person's truth to maintain everyone else's comfort. You're not my family anymore." She turned and walked into her house, leaving. Her mother standing alone on the porch with her tears and her failed manipulation, and Michael followed close behind, locking the door with a quiet finality that felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Through the living room window, Rose watched her mother sit in her car for nearly 20 minutes, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine grief. Part of Rose, the part that had been trained from birth to be responsible for everyone else's emotional well-being, wanted to run outside and comfort her, to find some way to make this easier for all of them. But the larger part of her, the part that had been born in the sterile examination room where Dr. Chen delivered the news of her loss, remained unmoved. Her mother's grief was the natural consequence of choosing to protect an abuser instead of supporting a victim. It was the price of prioritizing the comfort of the guilty over the justice owed to the innocent. When Margaret finally drove away, Rose felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction that came from refusing to be manipulated into complicity with her own victimization. The satisfaction lasted exactly 3 days. Rose was at work, trying to focus on the case files spread across her desk at the Department of Human Services, when her supervisor, Linda, knocked on her door. Linda Hernandez was a woman in her early 40s who had built her career on helping families navigate crisis situations, and her expression carried the kind of careful neutrality that Rose had learned to associate with bad news delivered by well-meaning professionals. "Rose, I need to speak with you about something," Linda said, closing the door behind her and taking the chair across from Rose's cluttered desk. "I've received some concerning information that I need to discuss with you." Rose felt her stomach drop, the way it had every morning since the miscarriage when she first remembered what had happened and realized it wasn't just a nightmare. "What kind of concerning information?" Linda shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with whatever she was about to say. "I received a call this morning from Margaret Matthews, who identified herself as your mother. She expressed some serious concerns about your mental state following your recent pregnancy loss." The words hit Rose like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the fluorescent lights above her desk seem suddenly too bright. Her mother had weaponized her workplace, had turned her job, one of the few stable, positive things left in her life, into another battlefield in the war to force her compliance. "What did she tell you?" Rose asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in her chest. Linda consulted her notes, her expression growing more uncomfortable by the moment. "She indicated that you've been making wild accusations against your sister, claiming that your miscarriage was the result of deliberate assault rather than an accidental fall. She also mentioned that you've cut off all contact with your family and that she's concerned you may be experiencing a psychotic break or some form of severe depression that's affecting your judgment." Rose stared at her supervisor, a woman she had worked with for 3 years, whose professional judgment she had always respected, and realized that her mother had just attempted to destroy her career along with everything else. The attack was so calculated, so precisely aimed at the things Rose valued most, that she almost had to admire its efficiency. "Linda," Rose said carefully, "I need you to know that everything my mother told you is a lie designed to discredit me and protect my sister from facing consequences for deliberately causing my miscarriage." Linda's expression didn't change, but Rose caught the subtle shift in her posture that suggested she was now viewing this conversation through a clinical lens, assessing Rose's mental state rather than simply listening to a colleague's explanation of a difficult situation. "Rose, I understand that pregnancy loss can be incredibly traumatic, and sometimes trauma can affect our perception of events," Linda said, her voice taking on the carefully modulated tone she used with difficult clients. Have you considered speaking with someone about what you're experiencing? The department has excellent mental health resources, and I think it might be beneficial for you to— Stop, Rose interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through Linda's professional conditioning. Just stop. I am not having a psychotic break. I am not experiencing delusions or depression severe enough to affect my judgment. I am a trained social worker who has spent 3 years documenting abuse and neglect, and I know the difference between an accident and an assault. Linda leaned back in her chair, and Rose could see her making mental notes, probably documenting this conversation for Rose's personnel file. The realization that her own supervisor was now viewing her as potentially unstable rather than as a colleague in crisis made Rose feel sick with a combination of betrayal and recognition. This was how it worked, wasn't it? When victims spoke truth that made people uncomfortable, when they refused to accept the sanitized version of events that allowed everyone else to sleep better at night, they were labeled as mentally unstable, as unreliable witnesses to their own experiences. Rose, Linda said, I'm not suggesting that your perceptions aren't valid to you, but when family members express concerns about someone's mental health, especially following a traumatic event, I have a professional obligation to take those concerns seriously. I'm going to need you to undergo a psychological evaluation before you can continue with your current caseload. The words hit Rose like a series of physical blows. Her caseload included 6 families, including 3 children who were currently in emergency foster care pending resolution of abuse investigations. These were kids who trusted her, who had built relationships with her, who needed consistency and stability in their chaotic lives. Now her mother's manipulation had succeeded in stripping away Rose's ability to help those children, had transformed her from a protector into someone who needed to be protected from her own supposedly delusional thinking. You're punishing me for being the victim of assault, Rose said, standing up from her desk chair with movements that felt disconnected from her conscious mind. You're taking away my ability to help vulnerable children because my mother called and told you lies designed to discredit me. Linda stood as well, her expression shifting from professional concern to something approaching alarm. Rose, I need you to calm down. I understand you're upset, but the way you're responding to this situation is actually reinforcing some of the concerns that have been raised about your current mental state. Rose looked at this woman she had considered a mentor and friend, this woman who was now gaslighting her with the practiced skill of someone who had learned to maintain institutional stability by sacrificing the truth when it became inconvenient. My husband was there, Rose said quietly. Michael witnessed everything that happened. He saw my sister deliberately push me down the stairs. He heard what she said afterward. Are you going to claim that he's also having a psychotic break? Linda shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having expected Rose to have corroborating witnesses to counter her mother's narrative. Well, Michael is your husband, and spouses sometimes. They sometimes share delusions, especially during times of intense grief and stress. The suggestion was so absurd, so clinically ridiculous, that Rose almost laughed. Instead, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out her purse, her movements deliberate and controlled. I'll undergo your psychological evaluation, Rose said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. But I want everything documented. I want records of my mother's call, records of this conversation, and records of every step in this process. Because when the psychologist confirms that I'm perfectly sane and that my perceptions are accurate, I'm going to want evidence of how this department responds to employees who report crimes committed against them. Linda's face flushed, and Rose could see the moment when her supervisor realized that this situation might not be as straightforward as Margaret Matthews had made it seem. Rose, that's not necessary. No one is questioning your competence or your integrity. We're simply— You absolutely are questioning my competence and my integrity, Rose interrupted. You're questioning my ability to distinguish between reality and delusion, which is literally the foundation of everything we do in this job. You're suggesting that my husband is also delusional, which calls into question your own professional judgment. And you're doing all of this based on a phone call from a woman who has never met you, who has no professional qualifications to assess anyone's mental health, and who has a vested interest in discrediting me to protect her other daughter from facing consequences for assault. Rose gathered her things and headed for the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Oh, and Linda, you might want to consider the legal implications of taking adverse employment action against someone based on unsubstantiated claims from hostile family members. The department's insurance company probably won't be thrilled about the potential lawsuit you just created. She left Linda standing in her office with her mouth open and her face pale, and walked through the building toward the exit with her head held high despite the curious stares of her colleagues. Word would spread quickly through the department that Rose Matthews was having some kind of breakdown, that she was making wild accusations and behaving erratically. But Rose found that she didn't care. The truth was the truth, regardless of how many people found it inconvenient. And if maintaining her sanity and her integrity meant losing her job, her family, and her reputation, then that was a price she was willing to pay. She was halfway to her car when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer it anyway. Mrs. Matthews, this is Detective Sarah Kim with the County Sheriff's Office. I understand you may have information about an assault that occurred at your parents' residence last week. Rose stopped walking, her heart pounding, so hard she could hear it in her ears. Who gave you my information? Actually, it was your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She was concerned about the confrontation she witnessed between you and your mother yesterday, and she mentioned that she had overheard some troubling details about your recent miscarriage. She felt it was important that law enforcement be made aware of the situation. Rose thought about the elderly woman who had been nothing but kind, who had watched the scene on her porch with growing concern and had apparently decided to take action, when Rose's own family wouldn't. The intervention felt like a gift, like the first sign that someone outside her immediate circle was willing to acknowledge the truth of what had happened. Yes, Rose said, her voice stronger than she felt. I have information about an assault. When can we meet? 3 hours later, Rose sat in a small conference room at the sheriff's office, telling her story to Detective Kim and a victim's advocate named Janet Torres. Michael sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring as they walked through the events of that terrible afternoon step by step. Detective Kim was a woman in her mid-30s with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested she had extensive experience interviewing trauma victims. She took notes while Rose spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never interrupting the flow of the narrative. Mrs. Matthews, Detective Kim said when Rose finished her account, I want you to know that what you've described constitutes assault in the second degree under state law. The fact that you were pregnant at the time of the assault, and that the assault resulted in the termination of your pregnancy, elevates this to a very serious felony. Rose felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Someone with authority was taking her seriously, was treating Lily's actions as crimes rather than family drama that needed to be managed and covered. What happens now? Michael asked, his hand finding Rose's under the table. Now we build a case, Detective Kim replied. We'll need medical records from your treatment following the fall, documentation of the pregnancy loss, and statements from any witnesses who were present during the assault. We'll also want to interview your sister and other family members. Rose thought about her parents' likely response to being interviewed by police, about the way they would close ranks to protect Lily and paint Rose as the unstable daughter who was trying to destroy their family with false accusations. But she also thought about her baby, about the life that had been stolen before it ever had a chance to draw breath. She thought about other women who might suffer Lily's violence in the future if there were no consequences for what she had done. I want to press charges, Rose said, the words feeling like both a declaration of war and a prayer for peace. I want my sister held accountable for what she did. Detective Kim nodded, making another note in her file. We'll start the investigation immediately. I should warn you, Mrs. Matthews, that family members often face pressure to recant their statements. In cases like this, your relatives may escalate their efforts to convince you to drop the charges. Rose thought about her mother's manipulation, about her job being threatened, about the isolation she was already experiencing as a result of choosing truth over family harmony. They can try, she said quietly. But I won't be changing my mind. Some things are more important than keeping the peace. As they left the sheriff's office, Rose felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settling in her stomach. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had chosen justice over the kind of false reconciliation her family preferred. There would be consequences, more manipulation attempts, more threats, probably more efforts to discredit her, and paint her as the villain in this story. But for the first time since that terrible afternoon, Rose felt like she was moving forward instead of being dragged backward by the weight of other people's expectations and comfort. The truth was a terrible burden sometimes, but it was also, Rose was learning, the only foundation solid enough to build a real life upon. The psychological evaluation that Linda had demanded turned out to be a blessing in disguise, though Rose didn't recognize it as such during the 3 grueling hours she spent in Dr. Patricia Vance's office, answering questions designed to assess her grip on reality. Dr. Vance was a clinical psychologist in her 50s who specialized in trauma assessment, and her approach was thorough and methodical, in ways that reminded Rose of Detective Kim's investigation. She asked detailed questions about the events leading up to the miscarriage, about Rose's family history, about her current emotional state, and her perceptions of the incident that had cost her her pregnancy. Unlike Linda, Dr. Vance listened without predetermined assumptions about what Rose's answer should be. She took notes, asked follow-up questions, and administered several standardized psychological assessments that measured everything from depression and anxiety to the accuracy of Rose's memory and her ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. The results delivered to Linda's office 3 days later with copies sent to Rose and her attorney were unequivocal in their clarity. Mrs. Matthews shows no signs of psychological disturbance, delusional thinking, or impaired judgment, Dr. Vance had written in her summary. Her account of events is consistent, detailed, and coherent. Her emotional responses are appropriate to the trauma she has experienced. Her perceptions appear to be accurate, and her decision-making capacity is fully intact. I find no psychological basis for questioning her competency or her reliability as a witness to the events she has described. The report went on to note that Rose was experiencing grief and anger consistent with pregnancy loss, but that these emotions were normal and healthy responses to trauma, rather than indicators of mental instability. Dr. Vance recommended counseling to help Rose process her loss, but emphasized that such counseling should be viewed as support for a healthy person dealing with extraordinary circumstances rather than treatment for mental illness. Rose read the report 3 times, each reading filling her with a vindication that felt almost as overwhelming as the original trauma. For weeks, everyone around her had been suggesting that her perceptions were unreliable, that her grief was making her paranoid, that her refusal to immediately forgive Lily indicated some form of mental breakdown. Now she had official confirmation that she was not crazy, not delusional, not experiencing any form of psychological disturbance that would affect her ability to accurately report what had happened to her. Linda's response to the report was swift and uncomfortable. She called Rose into her office the morning after receiving Dr. Vance's assessment, her expression carefully neutral, but her body language radiating the kind of tension that came from realizing she had made a significant professional error. "Rose, I want to apologize for the way this situation was handled," Linda said, though her apology had the stilted quality of something that had been reviewed by the department's legal team. Dr. Vance's evaluation makes it clear that the concerns raised about your mental state were unfounded. You're cleared to return to your full caseload immediately. Rose studied her supervisor's face. noting the careful way Linda avoided making eye contact, the slight flush that suggested embarrassment or anxiety. What about the families I was removed from? How are you going to explain to those children why their caseworker suddenly disappeared and then reappeared? Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. We've managed the transitions carefully to minimize disruption to the children involved. They were told you were dealing with a medical situation that required temporary leave. It was a diplomatic answer. That skirted the real issue, that Rose's employer had been so quick to believe her mother's lies that they had been willing to remove her from vulnerable cases without any actual evidence of impairment. The children Rose worked with had already experienced abandonment and instability. Having their caseworker suddenly vanish without explanation would have reinforced their worst fears about the unreliability of the adults who were supposed to protect them. I want a written apology in my personnel file, Rose said, her voice steady and professional. I want documentation that the concerns raised about my mental state were investigated and found to be completely without merit. And I want assurance that my mother will never again be allowed to interfere with my employment here. Linda nodded quickly, clearly eager to put this situation behind them. Of course, absolutely, whatever you need. But Rose wasn't finished. I also want you to know that I've filed a police report about the assault that caused my miscarriage and that I may be called to testify in criminal proceedings. I trust that the department will support me in seeking justice rather than treating my cooperation with law enforcement as another sign of mental instability. The color drained from Linda's face as the full implications of the situation became clear to her. Rose wasn't just an employee who had been wrongly accused of mental illness. She was the victim of a violent crime who had been further victimized by her employer's willingness to believe lies designed to discredit her. Of course, we'll support you, Linda said, though her voice lacked conviction. The department has policies in place to protect employees who are victims of crimes. Rose gathered her things and stood to leave, but paused at the door. Linda, I need you to understand something. What happened to me wasn't a family dispute that got out of hand. It wasn't an accident caused by high emotions. It was a deliberate assault that resulted in the death of my child. The fact that my attacker is related to me doesn't make it less serious or less criminal. I hope the department remembers that when it decides how to handle this situation going forward. She left Linda's office feeling a grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the simple pleasure of being believed, of having her truth validated by someone with the credentials to make such assessments. But the real vindication came later that afternoon, when Detective Kim called with an update on the investigation. Mrs. Matthews, we've completed our interviews with the witnesses who were present during the assault, Detective Kim said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested good news. I think you'll be interested to hear what we learned. Rose sat down in the privacy of her office, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She had expected her family members to lie, to minimize what they had seen, to paint Lily's actions as accidental or justified by emotional distress. What? Did they tell you? Rose asked. Well, your parents were exactly as uncooperative as you predicted, Detective Kim replied. They both insisted that what happened was a tragic accident, that Lily was emotionally distraught and didn't intend to cause any harm. They characterized the push as a gesture that got out of hand rather than a deliberate act of violence. Rose's heart sank. She had hoped that being interviewed by police might shock her parents into honesty, might make them realize that covering up for Lily could have serious legal consequences for all of them. However, Detective Kim continued, your Uncle Joe and your cousin Maria told a very different story. Rose straightened in her chair, remembering her father's older brother and his daughter, people she had always liked but hadn't been particularly close to. They had been at the house for the announcement, had witnessed everything that happened, but Rose hadn't expected them to contradict her parents' version of events. What did they say? Your uncle was very clear that what he witnessed was not an accident, Detective Kim said. He described watching your sister position herself deliberately, waiting for a moment when you were vulnerable at the top of the stairs. He said he actually started to move toward her because something about her posture and expression alarmed him, but he wasn't fast enough to prevent what happened. Rose felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed by someone who had been there, someone who had seen what she had seen and was brave enough to tell the truth about it. Maria corroborated her father's account, Detective Kim continued. She also provided some additional information that I think you should know about. She said that Lily made several comments during the family gathering that suggested premeditation. What kind of comments? According to Maria, Lily spent the first part of the afternoon making bitter remarks about your pregnancy, suggesting that you had planned the timing of your announcement to overshadow other family business. She also made several statements about how unfair it was that you always got what you wanted while she had to struggle for everything. Rose closed her eyes, remembering the tension she had sensed from Lily that afternoon, but had attributed to general stress about their father's will rather than specific malice toward her pregnancy. But the most significant statement, Detective Kim continued, came about 30 minutes before the assault. Maria said that Lily looked directly at your pregnant stomach and said, quote, "I wonder how much trauma it takes to end a pregnancy in the first trimester. I bet it wouldn't take much at all." The words hit Rose like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands shake. She had known that Lily's push was deliberate, had seen the calculation in her sister's eyes, but hearing confirmation that the attack had been planned and premeditated was almost more than she could process. "Mrs. Matthews, are you still there?" "Yes," Rose managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here. It's just hearing that she planned it, that she was thinking about how to hurt my baby." "I know this is difficult," Detective Kim said gently, "but I want you to know that we have enough evidence to proceed with formal charges. Between the witness statements and the medical evidence documenting your injuries and pregnancy loss, we have a strong case for assault in the second degree and unlawful termination of pregnancy." Rose felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of validation so profound that it almost felt physical. The legal system was going to acknowledge what her family had tried to cover up. Her sister would face consequences for what she had done. The death of Rose's baby would be officially recognized as a crime, rather than dismissed as a family accident. "When will you make the arrest?" Rose asked. "We're coordinating with the prosecutor's office to have warrants issued within the next few days," Detective Kim replied. "I want to prepare you for the fact that this is likely to create significant upheaval in your family relationships. Your parents will probably escalate their pressure on you to drop the charges, and there may be attempts to paint you as vindictive or unstable." Rose thought about the psychological evaluation that had already vindicated her, about the witnesses, who had finally told the truth, about the medical evidence that documented the reality of her loss. "Let them try," she said quietly. "I have the truth on my side now, and I have people who believe me." That evening, Rose and Michael sat in their living room with copies of all the official documents spread across their coffee table: Dr. Vance's psychological evaluation, Detective Kim's incident report, witness statements from Uncle Joe and Maria, medical records that documented the timeline and severity of Rose's injuries. It was a paper trail of vindication, official confirmation of everything Rose had been saying since the moment she regained consciousness at the bottom of her parents' marble staircase. But it was also a paper trail that would tear her family apart, that would transform private pain into public criminal proceedings. "Are you having second thoughts?" Michael asked, his voice gentle but concerned as he watched her study the documents. Rose looked up at her husband, this man who had stood by her when everyone else was trying to convince her that her perceptions were wrong, who had been willing to be labeled as delusional rather than abandon her truth. "No," she said firmly. "No second thoughts. This is bigger than just what Lily did to me. This is about what message we send to other people who might hurt pregnant women, about whether there are really consequences for this kind of violence or whether families can just cover it up and move on." Michael nodded, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. I'm proud of you, he said simply. I know this isn't easy, and I know it's going to get worse before it gets better. But you're doing the right thing. Rose squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. Tomorrow or the next day, or sometime very soon, her sister would be arrested. The careful facade her family had constructed would crumble under the weight of official scrutiny. The truth would finally have consequences. It wouldn't bring her baby back. Nothing could do that. But it might prevent other babies from dying, other women from being silenced, other families from using love and loyalty as weapons to protect abusers and silence victims. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts, and Rose saw her father's name on the caller ID. She had unblocked his number earlier that day, curious to see if the police interviews had changed his perspective at all. "Rose," he said when she answered, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been defeat. "We need to talk, all of us, as a family." Rose looked at Michael, who nodded encouragingly, then at the documents scattered across their coffee table that told the true story of what had happened to their child. "Yes, Dad," she said quietly. "I think we do." The family meeting took place 3 days later in the sterile conference room of a victim services center, neutral territory, that couldn't be dominated by the emotional manipulation tactics that had controlled Rose's childhood home for decades. Detective Kim had suggested the location, understanding that Rose needed to maintain her psychological safety, while still giving her family one final opportunity to acknowledge the truth and perhaps salvage some fragment of their relationships. Rose arrived early, wanting to settle herself in the unfamiliar environment before facing the people who had shaped her entire understanding of love, loyalty, and family obligation. Michael sat beside her, solid and reassuring, while Janet Torres, the victim's advocate, positioned herself nearby with the kind of protective alertness that came from years of shepherding trauma victims through hostile family dynamics. When her parents entered the room, Rose was shocked by how much they seemed to have aged in the weeks since their confrontation on her front porch. Her father, usually meticulously groomed and confidently authoritative, looked rumpled and uncertain, his 60-year-old face showing new lines of stress and exhaustion. Her mother appeared smaller somehow, as if the weight of maintaining the family's preferred narrative had physically diminished her. Behind them came Lily, and Rose felt her chest constrict at the sight of her sister for the first time since the assault. At 26, Lily had always been beautiful in the sharp, dramatic way that drew attention and admiration. But now she looked hollow, her usually perfect makeup absent, and her blonde hair hanging limp around a face that showed the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than simple lack of sleep. For a moment, just a moment, Rose felt a flicker of the old protective instinct that had defined her relationship with her younger sister for most of their lives. Lily looked broken, genuinely damaged by the consequences that were finally catching up with her destructive behavior. But then Rose remembered the cold calculation in Lily's eyes before the push, the satisfaction in her voice as she whispered about destroying their family, the complete absence of remorse or genuine apology in all the weeks that had followed. The moment of sympathy passed like a shadow across the sun, leaving behind the clear recognition that sometimes people who looked like victims were actually perpetrators who had finally been held accountable for their actions. "Rosie," her father said, using her childhood nickname with the kind of false intimacy that had been one of his primary manipulation tools throughout her life. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I know this has been incredibly difficult for everyone involved." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on Rose. Even now, even with criminal charges pending and witness statements that contradicted their preferred narrative, her father was still trying to frame this as a mutual tragedy rather than a deliberate crime committed by one family member against another. "Dad," Rose said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest, "I agreed to this meeting because Detective Kim thought it might be helpful for you to hear directly from me why I'm pressing charges against Lily. I'm hoping that, finally, after all these weeks, Someone in this family will be willing to acknowledge what really happened and show some genuine concern for the child that was murdered. Her mother flinched at the word murdered, her face crumpling with the kind of grief that might have been genuine or might have been one more performance designed to manipulate Rose's emotions. Sweetheart, please don't use that word. What happened was a terrible accident during a moment of emotional overwhelm. Lily never intended. Stop, Rose interrupted, holding up her hand with a gesture that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. I'm not going to sit here and listen to lies anymore. We have witness statements that prove Lily planned this attack. We have her own words, spoken in front of multiple people, wondering aloud about how much trauma it would take to end a pregnancy. This wasn't an accident, and I'm done pretending it was to make everyone else feel better. Lily spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice small and shaky in a way that would have triggered Rose's protective instincts just a few weeks ago. Rose, I know you're angry, and I understand why. But please, you have to believe that I never meant for this to happen. I was upset about Dad's will, and I said some things I didn't mean, and I made a terrible mistake. But I would never deliberately hurt you or your baby. The performance was masterful. The trembling voice, the tears that seemed to appear on cue, the perfect balance of taking responsibility while simultaneously denying intent. Rose could see why this approach had worked so well throughout their childhood, why their parents had always chosen to believe Lily's versions of events rather than investigate the truth. But Rose was no longer the child who could be manipulated by false tears and carefully crafted apologies. She was a trained social worker who had spent years learning to recognize manipulation tactics. And she was a trauma victim who had finally learned to trust her own perceptions over other people's comfort. Lily, Rose said quietly, 30 minutes. Before you pushed me down those stairs, you looked at my pregnant stomach and said, I wonder how much trauma it takes to end a pregnancy in the first trimester. I bet it wouldn't take much at all. Maria heard you say it. Uncle Joe heard you say it. That's not the kind of thing someone says by accident when they're upset about a will. The color drained from Lily's face, and Rose saw the exact moment when her sister realized that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. The witnesses who were supposed to support the family's version of events had told the truth instead, had chosen honesty over loyalty to the family's reputation. That's not, I didn't mean, Lily stammered, her composure finally cracking to reveal something desperate and ugly underneath. Yes, you did mean it, Rose said, her voice carrying a certainty that came from months of processing trauma and finally accepting the truth of her own experiences. You meant every word of it. You were angry that I was pregnant when you couldn't. Get your own life together. You were jealous that I was happy when you were miserable. And you decided that if you couldn't have what I had, then I shouldn't have it either. Rose's father tried to intervene, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had once been enough to end any family dispute. Rose, that's enough. You're being cruel and vindictive, and it's not helping anyone heal from this tragedy. But Rose was no longer the daughter who automatically deferred to her father's judgment, who prioritized his comfort over her own truth. She was a woman who had learned that some wounds couldn't heal until the poison was drained from them completely. Only thing that would be cruel and vindictive, Rose replied, would be allowing Lily to face no consequences for murdering my child. The only thing that would be tragic would be teaching her that she can destroy other people's lives whenever she's angry or jealous and face no real accountability for her actions. The room fell silent except for the sound of Lily's increasingly desperate sobbing and Margaret's whispered attempts to comfort her. Rose watched her family's carefully constructed facade finally collapse completely, revealing the toxic dynamics that had been hidden beneath decades of forced harmony and superficial love. Her father looked older than she had ever seen him. His authority evaporated in the face of truths that couldn't be negotiated or managed away. Her mother appeared lost, as if the script she had been following her entire adult life had suddenly been taken away, and she had no idea how to improvise. And Lily looked like what she had always been underneath the beauty and charm and manipulative tears. She looked like someone who had finally been caught, who had run out of people willing to clean up her messes and absorb the consequences of her destructive choices. "What do you want from us?" Margaret asked finally, her voice broken and small. "What do you need us to do to make this right?" Rose felt a flicker of hope at the question, the first sign that someone in her family might be willing to prioritize justice over their own comfort. But then she looked at her mother's face and saw the calculation behind the apparent surrender, the familiar pattern of strategic concessions designed to minimize consequences rather than genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "I don't want you to make this right," Rose said quietly, her voice carrying a finality that seemed to settle over the room like dust. "There is no making this right. My baby is dead because your daughter murdered them. Nothing you say or do can change that." She looked directly at her mother, meeting Margaret's desperate gaze with unwavering clarity. "What I want is for you to stop pretending this was an accident. What I want is for you to acknowledge that Lily planned and executed an assault that killed your grandchild. What I want is for this family to choose truth over comfort for once in our lives." Margaret's face crumpled completely, her carefully maintained composure dissolving into raw grief. "But if we do that, if we admit that if we say she did this deliberately, then we lose her too. She'll go to prison, Rose. Our family will be destroyed." "Our family was destroyed the moment Lily pushed me down those stairs," Rose replied. "The moment you all chose to protect her instead of seeking justice for my murdered child, any real family we might have had ceased to exist. What you're trying to preserve isn't a family, it's a conspiracy to cover up a crime." Her father made one last attempt at the authoritative intervention that had once been his signature move. "Rose, you need to think about the consequences of what you're doing. Not just for Lily, but for all of us. Your mother and I are not young people. The stress of a trial, the publicity, the shame of having our private business dragged through, the courts, it could destroy us." Rose felt something click into place inside her chest, a final piece of understanding that completed the puzzle she had been working on for months. Even now, even faced with incontrovertible evidence of Lily's guilt and the reality of their grandchild's murder, her parents were asking her to prioritize their comfort over justice. They were asking her to sacrifice her truth, her healing, and her baby's memory to spare them the inconvenience of dealing with the natural consequences of enabling an abuser for 26 years. "Dad," Rose said, her voice gentle but implacable, "I've spent my entire life prioritizing your comfort over my own well-being. I've been the daughter who made things easier, who smoothed over conflicts, who absorbed everyone else's pain so you wouldn't have to deal with difficult emotions or uncomfortable truths." She looked around the room at these people who had shaped her understanding of love and loyalty, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. "But I'm not that daughter anymore. That daughter died with my baby on those marble steps. What's left is a woman who has learned that enabling destructive behavior isn't love. It's cowardice dressed up as compassion." Lily's sobs grew louder, more desperate, as if she could sense that her usual tactics weren't working, that the family dynamics she had manipulated so successfully for so long were finally shifting beyond her control. "Please, Rose," Lily begged, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine desperation. "Please don't do this to me. I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you. But I can't go to prison. I won't survive it. You're my sister. You're supposed to protect me, not destroy me." The words hit Rose like an echo from their childhood, when 5-year-old Lily would cry those same words after breaking something or hurting someone, when teenage Lily would use that exact phrase to escape consequences for increasingly serious misbehavior. "You're supposed to protect me, not destroy me." But Rose finally understood what she should have recognized years ago. Protecting someone from the consequences of their destructive actions wasn't protection at all. It was enabling that guaranteed The destructive behavior would continue and escalate. "I did protect you, Lily," Rose said quietly. "I protected you for 26 years. I covered for your lies. I made excuses for your cruelty. I absorbed the damage you caused to other people, so you wouldn't have to face consequences. And where did that protection get us? It got us to a place where you felt entitled to murder my child because you were jealous of my happiness." Rose stood up from her chair, her movements deliberate and final. Michael rose beside her, his presence solid and supportive as she faced the most difficult moment of her life.